Thank you for joining us for the Fiber to the Everything panel. I have the pleasure of having these 5 gentlemen here to speak to you about the continued growth of fiber deployment around the world. We have Jerry Jerami here, VP of Wholesale Solutions at ATT. We have Jim Noty, the CEO of Bandwidth IG, Eric Krusch, the COO of Eurofiber, Jesus Romero, the COO of Converged ICT Solutions, and Andres Orlando, President of Zayo Group. All right, so as you all may know already, the global bandwidth growth has been phenomenal in the past year, especially off the back of cloud hyperscalers growth, driven mostly by the new emerging technology, med tech. We have smart cities, Web 3.0, VR, AR, and a lot of this demand is driving different patterns and demands from enterprises and consumers. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Andres. Zayo just announced today a big expansion and upgrade of 400G. So we'd just like to understand what are some of the demand drivers that shape Zayo's fiber deployment, and what are the demand drivers under consideration?
Yeah, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, these are a little, I'm glad to be here with everyone. So look, I mean, we're extremely bullish on fiber, as you can imagine. We think the next 10 years in terms of demand and amount of change in this industry is going to dwarf what we've seen in the last 25 years. And there's a few things going on. And by the way, the numbers support that. I think, the last time we looked, $1.3 trillion being spent annually on data center infrastructure, $1.1 trillion being spent on 5G infrastructure, 80 billion IoT devices in the next 3 years, some $500 billion in the next decade. So we think we're only going to see massive increases, not declines. And really, it's the same forces driving that are driving kind of most of the conversation at the conference this week. It's digital transformation, which used to be an option and now is a requirement unless your enterprise is going to be left behind. It's hyper velocity of data growth. It's the adoption of really high bandwidth intensive applications like predictive analytics and IoT and 5G and cloud and computation. So we all of the signals that we're following and that we're building our strategy against says that demand is not only great today, but it's going to continue. And really, there's 2 dynamics that we're trying to care for. One is convergence that's happening in the industry between data centers and towers and small cells and the edge and the cloud. But also for every enterprise, increasingly they're trying to figure out their core to edge, their edge to cloud, their edge to edge strategy. And we believe that fiber is the artery that's going to continue to enable that entire ecosystem.
And you for Zayo had expanded its Longhaul. But when we look at, like you said, there's this convergence between the edge and 5G, and there's a big growth in data center. So metro growth is a big thing as well. So I wanted to pass it on to you, Jim, to talk about Bandwidth IG, where you guys have really focused in on 3 specific regions, right? The Bay Area, Portland, and Atlanta. Can you speak more to the kind of demand that you're seeing out of the data centers?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so for all the reasons that Andres just laid out, we see the business in between the data centers is about to be hit by a tsunami, right? So we see this growth of data going on as these businesses are converging, or not converging, but transforming themselves digitally. And we believe that that's just going to put more pressure on the metro network. and far more pressure on the network between the data centers. So we are, in essence, a dark fiber provider in 3 metro areas, Atlanta, San Francisco Bay Area, and Hillsboro, Oregon. And we spend all our time thinking about what the occupants of those data centers need. So the conversations we're in, the customers are emphasizing, I need low signal loss, I need low latency, I need maximum diversity, and I need plenty of inventory to grow. And that's what we've spent our time thinking about. That's why we're spending our money, rebuilding and expanding those networks in between those data centers.
Thanks, Jim. And over to Eric, we see these different trends coming out of the U.S., North America, as opposed to Europe, and some of the strategies that the hyperscalers have are different in the different regions. What are you seeing in Europe in terms of the demands?
Yeah, so what we have been seeing the last few years, and it's even accelerating now, is that there is a clear demand of hyperscalers to build their own infrastructure. So Eurofiber has always been engaged with hyperscalers in the Netherlands where we started, but we also extended our business to Belgium, to France, and to Germany. And what we do together with those players is really map out what is the most viable approach to extend your network in Europe. Europe is a bit of a difficult continent. I mean, if you're used to the US and you go to Europe, that's a totally different ballgame. It's every country has its own regulation.
It's not as hard as California.
Well, I cannot comment on California, but the weather is okay. But apart from that, I don't know anything about it. But look, if you look at Europe, it's much more like a federation of different countries with all their own rulings. Permitting is very different. So what we do is helping the hyperscalers with one consistent SLA to work in all the different countries where we are, and also adapt our network rollout even to their demands. Like, for instance, making sure that we have our ELA sites to make sure that we have amplifier stations for the high capacity networks they want to build. So it's a hand-in-hand development of the network together with hyperscalers, and they boost our footprint that we have in those 4 countries. So it's a win-win. We help them to get rid of all the hassle that they might have looking at it from a US-centric point of view, and they help us extending our network so we're even more competitive in what we do.
So now we talked about a lot of the demands coming out of the hyperscalers. There's another part of the market, more of a B2C, the consumer part. We were talking about Jesus, back in the Philippines, you guys started Converge to really build out quality broadband network for a population that was lacking it. So can you speak more to what the demands you're seeing and the kind of dynamics between the competition over there?
Thank you. By the way, notice I mentioned, right, I'm sitting at the edge because that's where we are in Southeast Asia. So Philippines is very underserved and in some cases unserved. So our mission is to fiber power the country. In 4 years, we built, as of today, 6.5 million ports. That's about 12 million homes passed. And the ambition is by next year to provide fiber to at least 55% of the households. Wow. Most Filipinos were using legacy DSL, cable modem. We were a cable modem operator ourselves and wireless broadband. So since we had started a journey, what surprised us is the appetite to buy the service. And our pricing today is probably not at the level of a Singapore or Hong Kong, like at $30 we provide 100 megabits. But today, that is more than enough for the needs, which were brought to fore by the pandemic, right? So three plays, we say. One, the first one we noticed was entertainment shifted. When we went on a hard lockdown back in 2020, network traffic surged. Guess what? It was Netflix and YouTube and all of the other video applications. And then people started to work from home. When school restarted, it was study from home. So for now, what we're seeing on the B2C side is a lot of video, whether it's streaming video or interactive video. On the business side, we're also seeing a lot of demand now, driven by migration to the cloud, right? And of course, digital transformation. Before you had screens with text, now it's all graphics and very heavy traffic. And with the applications now running on public clouds, it has put more strain on the network. So today, these are the drivers that we're seeing, and I echo your point earlier. Fiber to us is the only solution that can scale and that can provide an affordable service. And so far, our results have been showing it. We're the fastest growing broadband provider. In 4 years, we became a strong number 2, driven by fiber.
Yeah. And obviously, during COVID, we all went through the spike in bandwidth, right? Just like in the Philippines, we did in North America and in Europe and across the world. Jerry, that coming to the consumer broadband and the race between getting fiber to the home and also deploying 5G. So can you speak to how AT&T is seeing the kind of demands that's happening and how you're trying to balance the two fiber deployment and the 5G rollout?
Sure. Thanks, Jesse. From an AT&T perspective, certainly we're going through a transformational period in fiber. Our fiber footprint that we're looking to grow aggressively is paramount to our long-term success. So we are poised in terms of, you mentioned 5G, the two really coincide. And from a consumer standpoint, since COVID, you've got some 35 million Americans now that work virtually. So you have to have virtual solutions. You've got to have a good broadband service that allows people to work from remote locations, work from home. So we see tremendous upside in small to medium-sized businesses. We're seeing tremendous exponential growth there, as well as in terms of over the last 5 years, AT&T has grown our carrier hotel business, which again, trying to get that connectivity closer to key metro areas. We've grown that business by 5x. So we have a number of key initiatives that are making a difference and clearly poised for exponential growth. We see a 5x growth in data over the next 5 years. And today, you asked about fiber footprint. We cover just under 700,000 buildings today. That's about 3 million businesses. And we're looking to grow that to 5 million by the end of 2025, not to mention another 25 million households. So let's say 30 million, by 2025. So certainly aggressive plans, but exciting times.
Definitely aggressive plan. And speaking to all this deployment, during COVID, our supply chain had been under pressure. And with this fast-moving deployment across the world of fiber, we see a huge backlog, right? Corning is now building a new plant in North Carolina, and I know AT&T had collaborated with them. Can you speak more to how this dynamic is affecting your strategy and deployment?
Yeah, Corning's a great example. I think Corning's got relationships with a number of carriers, obviously, but they are a key supplier, and we've got a great global access management team that works very closely with all of our suppliers. And to date, I'm pleased to report, especially from a wholesale standpoint, we are meeting the commitments that we've made to our clients. I think about the aggressive Ethernet to the cell rollout that we have with a number of our key wireless partners. And so in general, while there has been some constraints when you talk about network termination equipment in particular, we've been able to work through it here for the most part in 2022 and expect, as I mentioned earlier, the prolific growth that we expect to see. We expect our suppliers to stay with us and stay up with the demand.
Right. And are you seeing the same thing in Europe, Eric? Obviously, we have a very limited number of suppliers for these very valuable fiber assets.
Yeah, of course, we see the same mechanisms as was just commented through AT&T. For us, it's very important that we always had a limited but very, trustworthy set of partners. So in times of scarcity, that is the most, I think, decisive thing. So how deep is the relationship that you have with your supplier? So we are very open always in our forecasting mechanisms, in our ordering schemes, but also in development that we do together with them. And that really paid off very nicely during the pandemic. And that is the way we work, because we feel if we are really a infrastructure player, so for us, the supplier is not just, somebody you talk to with the purchasing department. You really develop your network design together, you roll out together. So the relationship is much more intimate than just transactional. And I think that helped us a lot during the pandemic. Also, we're not the size of AT&T, so sometimes it's easier to help us instead of coming with all the bulk orders that big, huge companies do. So our mid-size helped us a lot, to be honest, combined with the very strong established partnership that we had with our suppliers.
And how do you prioritize your deployment in terms of just the competing demands and supply that's strained?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our network, we have a combination of, let's say, new builds and migration and upgrades. And during pandemic, we really prioritized on new builds, because a lot of the, let's say, crucial customers that came to us to the pandemic were public institutions like hospitals that needed upgrades immediately, or certain public authorities that wanted to make sure that they were in a good shape with resilience of the network and bandwidth. So we prioritized those, and sometimes postponed a little bit migration upgrade activities, because we already had a good SLA level and we could postpone that a little bit. So by doing so, we could always offer the service that our crucial customers wanted to have.
Something that, and I apologize, I think, Jerry, you mentioned earlier, the hyperscalers are getting into fiber as well, right? We've seen in the past where they were buying up a lot of wave, and now they've transitioned to mostly dark fiber in mature markets where their data center, they have their big mega data centers. How do you see this entry or this engagement by the hyperscaler affecting the infrastructure market?
Use that for?
Oh, I was popcorning it, but let's go down the line. Jim, I think you were next.
Yeah, no, happy to answer that. So we have not seen them self-perform network that often. So when it comes to hyperscalers, we're finding that they would rather buy it from somebody or lease it from someone else than build it themselves. So I know that there's been discussion about hyperscalers self-performing on the network side. I've seen that as less likely than reported. So we've got great relationships with those guys, and we've built out a lot of network for them. So yeah, I'm not. I don't feel like that has been a competitive threat for us at all.
Andres, you're making a face, so I'm going to pass it on over to you.
Well, first I didn't realize I was making a face, but so we have seen it a little bit more, perhaps than Jim. I would say our largest product set still by far is fiber, dark, long haul, metro. And so we, be thoughtful about it and strategic, but generally speaking, we think this is a good thing. And it's opened up opportunities, not just with the hyperscalers and the build out of their data centers and their edge strategy, but the carriers and their build out of 5G and the deployment of their C-band spectrum, or even enterprises. I mean, there are enterprises who are interested in dark fiber, and it's created partnership opportunities for us. Clearly, our biggest customers are the carriers and the hyperscalers. But also, it's increasingly created co-investment opportunities, both domestically and through subsea opportunities. So, you know, we're unique, I think, in the ecosystem in that, you know, we are exclusively, well, not exclusively, but we're heavily balanced in the dark fiber space, and as the largest independent provider of dark fiber in North America and growing in Europe, we think this is a really good development for our business model.
So, staying on the topic of how Facebook or Google are getting really into putting their agenda into infrastructure, and one of Facebook's big agenda is obviously the metaverse and getting more eyeballs onto the internet. And we wanted to talk to you, Jesus, about if you've seen the touch of Facebook over in Southeast Asia and how they're managing and pushing their agendas over in that region.
Well, Philippines is one of the biggest Facebook using countries, for good and bad. We just had an election, largely influenced by that. In the past, infrastructure for access to content like Facebook is paid for by service providers like us. So we have to bring their content from their hubs like Taiwan or Singapore and Hong Kong. So we pay for the international capacity. We host their CDNs. And it comes up as a question like, why is access to the internet a bit more expensive in our country than others? Well, you know, the answer is simple. In Singapore, they're right there, right? They brought all the capacity, they pay for everything. In our case, we're currently paying for it. So on the infrastructure side, it's shifting. We co-invested with them in Bifrost, so they're going to bring their own submarine cable capacity into Asia. Hopefully by 2024, some of it actually lands in the Philippines. And that should, you know, kind of take off the load from us on spending for all the infra to get to their content. They are a very large driver of revenue there, no? From advertising. Again, when you have like 75 million people constantly on Facebook for like 6 hours a day, it's not only on the bandwidth side, but it's also on the monetization. You know, like Facebook videos, ads, you know, all of those things, sellers on that system. So we're working closely not only with them, but others to make this access even more seamless. You know, it's a trend that you cannot reverse anymore.
Fair enough. So flipping over to the other kind of competitors, you know, between the telcos, now that we're in a race to deploy fiber, different country, different regions, different companies are taking different strategy in terms of how do we deal with overbuild. And we just want to pass it over to you, Jerry. I know it's a fight for how much land you can get, and especially with the PE funds coming in, for instance, with Brightspeed that just came out off of Apollo and Lumen's carve out. So how do you guys perceive the threat of overbuild?
I don't know if we really perceive it as a threat as much as an opportunity. In the case of Brightspeed, clearly we will leverage their footprint to help us, maybe from a wireless perspective as an example. But clearly we will continue to build out aggressively in our footprint and you know, serve our customers, and obviously where we have the owner economics, we're going to leverage that. But to the point of a Brightspeed or others, there's a lot of players out there, and so we look at it as an opportunity to partner and help us perhaps in areas where we're not as penetrated. And so clearly we see partnership opportunities, and I think there's a mutual interest there. So so we're excited about that. I will tell you that for the past 10 years or so, AT&T has been overbuilding in fiber. We've got buildings lit that, quite frankly, we could do more in those buildings today. So we welcome, whether you want to call it competition or potential partnerships, I think it's great for the business, and it's just going to drive fiber to the home, to the business much quicker.
And Eric, you mentioned earlier that Europe is multiple countries, different, a giant confederation. And I know certain areas in Europe is much more keen on overbuild than others. For instance, Spain, the cost to lay fiber, the payback is much shorter, whereas in Germany, it's much higher, and Deutsche Telekom had come out and said, hey, we're not going to overbuild. What are some of the other trends that you see over there?
Yeah, I think the common denominator for these overbuild situations is simply the cost. I mean, if it doesn't cost you that much, of course you will take the risk to do it. And then depending on the local situation, the cost can be high or not. If you look at, for instance, France, we have a very strong regulation of Orange, and meaning that everybody can use the ducts of Orange. And building out a fiber network, I can compare those countries, and I'm always very, very happy when I see the French numbers because it's fast, it's cheap, and you can get up and running quite quickly. The downside is that you have a lot of price competition, so it all comes at a cost, of course.
Right.
But in countries like, for instance, Belgium or Germany or Netherlands, we have to trench, we have to build the network, and then it's less likely that you will be overbuilt because the capex costs are simply too high. And in those countries, you will see normally that the price level are much more attractive than in a country like France. So it all goes hand in hand.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, we can still make a good return in both countries. So that's the good news. But you need to take care of those characteristics and not try to apply one plain vanilla approach because it will be different per country.
Definitely. And I know I see a few of the audience has sent in some questions, so we'll go over some of these questions and get back to the other questions in a bit. But since we just were talking about the build out and the costs, what do you think will be the role of long haul fiber in terms of capex needs? Do you really need long haul fiber? I'm gonna potentially throw this out to the audience who would like to pitch in here.
There are a lot of city pairs that aren't served right now by long haul fiber, so there is definitely a need for investment there.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree. And one is route. So you referenced earlier today. So Zayo announced earlier today our largest organic expansion of our network, and it had three components. One was more routes, to Jim's point, in critical areas where there's either not sufficient supply or there isn't access at all. Two is the upgrading of our Waves network. We were one of the first US-based carriers to upgrade our Waves networks to 400 gig. And so you've got an access, a number of pairs issue, but you also just have a capacity. If you go back to where we started this conversation in terms of spiking demand, you're going to need to continue, we're all going to need to continue to invest in long haul to meet that demand, both domestically and in terms of the subsea infrastructure, which we also announced our continued investment in to make it seamless, particularly for multinationals to connect different continents around the world.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think that one of the interesting trends that also drives long haul a bit more is the fact that we will get much more regional data centers. So it's not all clustered in FLAP, but it's going to expand. Maybe not all of it will be edge, but we will certainly have regional data centers, and it will pop up in places where you normally wouldn't have, logically already, your long-haul network in place. So you need to follow the data center, in fact, to fiber them up.
Definitely, and with the price of land going up around FLAP, definitely the data centers are more likely going to go further away from the edge, right? So, Eric, you mentioned earlier there's always a cost of overbuild, and there's price competition. So I think this question here, realistically, how many last mile fiber providers can exist and succeed in the metro market? And we talked about that, right? Jerry, we were in terms of overbuilding and getting into the building first. If you're competing with Verizon and all the local carriers, how what do you see that, how does that play out?
You know, again, I mentioned owner economics in our footprint. So while other fiber providers can compete, we're looking to expand our footprint. Now, we will go outside of our footprint where it makes economic sense. There's metro areas outside of AT&T's footprint that are interesting to us, and we see opportunities, and so we'll continue to build on that. But as I mentioned earlier, we see the opportunity to really partner with some of these fiber players and to augment, you know, where if they've got a cheaper proposition and one we can leverage, you know, we'll take a look at that. But all in all, again, I think we're very focused on the build out in our territory and select markets where we can expand our franchise. We will do that. But you know, again, feel good about our position and the opportunity ahead of us.
And then I know there's the comment about interest rate.
Sorry, do you mind if I address that?
Oh yes, please, Jim.
So in my mind, there's an awful lot of use cases on the, sorry about the feedback, in the metro. There's small cell. There are carriers out there that are only focused on small cell, and they're making money at it, right? There's carriers out there that are only focused on the E-rate business, and they're making money at it. I'm a carrier that's only focused on data center to data center, and we're making money at that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the metro, and it just depends on the use case and the economics of being able to reach out to those particular end users.
Definitely. Completely agree. I mean, obviously, you have to pick your niche and work on and build out for that niche of the market. But going over to the interest rate here, we know in the past 5 years we've seen a lot of investment in fiber from private equity and internally at major incumbents. But now that the interest rate had risen in the past year, what are the effects that you're seeing out there? What are the conversations that are being had around investment in fiber? And I'm just going to give it out to the group who would like to answer first here.
Well, I mean, we're all into this business for the long term, right? So I don't think that the current high interest rate will fundamentally change our approach. Mm-hmm. Of course, we don't like it. Let's be very clear on that. And of course, it will, on the short term, have some effect on your return that you expect. But in the long term, we've always seen, you know, interest rates going up and down. And if you're in this business to make money in 2 or 3 years, then I'm not sure this is the right business to be in. So we take this as a given. Mm-hmm. And of course, we are looking all the time how we can improve our deployment approaches. Mm-hmm. As I said before, we're working very closely with partners. Mm-hmm. And for now, more than ever, we're looking at how can we build smarter, mm-hmm. how can we get lower cost and capex, not only benefiting us, but also the contacts we work with. Mm-hmm. How we can give them more certainty on volumes, mm-hmm. driving the cost down. But it's not like changing our ambition. But of course, we need to be much more cautious than we used to be. Any objections?
Let me contribute. From our perspective, it starts with having a good operating model. For example, the massive rollout we did was based on a program, so we knew upfront what it was going to be. The traditional way is you outsource the whole thing. What do you get in an outsourcing situation? People putting margins upon margins. So costs add up and multiply. So we did a very different approach. We own a subsidiary 100% that builds our network. So, it's our internal cost. We buy the materials ourselves. We knew what the cost was because the first blast that we did was outsourced. And that's when we quickly realized this guy doesn't build the fiber boxes, doesn't manufacture fiber cables, and so on and so forth. So they just layer margin upon margin. There will still be a hit. I mean, the interest rates leads to higher inflation and we're gonna see all of these prices inch up. But my point is that if you had outsourced it in the first place, you're gonna get a double whammy. In our case, it's insourced. We will experience higher costs, but at a lower intensity than in a traditional model of building the network.
Thanks, Jesus. And just to stay on you for a bit, Jesus, and to go to this other question about 5G, and I think this 5G question has been talked about many times already since its introduction, right? Will 5G replace fiber, and what's the dynamic that you see in the Philippines, especially because getting to harder to reach area, 5G is touted as the alternative as opposed to deploying fiber, which might be a bit too expensive to do.
Now, actually, that would be a bad question to ask the Philippines because tower densities are one of the lowest in Asia and the world. I think Ghana has more towers than the Philippines. Now, having said that, millimeter wave. If you're looking at cell site densities, small cells of 150, 200 meters, right? So that's going to be a lot of small cells. And us, we'd love to sell fiber to the small cell operators, okay? But having said that, today when we see 5G signals, and it's not even millimeter wave, the speed is decent, right? 100, 150 meg. Latency is acceptable, 12, 13 milliseconds. On our fiber, we do 2 milliseconds, by the way. Now you do millimeter wave, your radius is quite small, okay? So I think from a serviceability perspective, you're still probably better off with legacy LTE or, 5G on the 3-point-something megahertz band, gigahertz band. Second is we're a tropical country, so rain profiles are not going to be attractive. And then finally, can they actually provide unlimited capacity, same as we can do on fiber? Definitely a whole lot more bandwidth, but today what we're seeing in the Philippines is that nobody can still offer unlimited. At some point, you're going to have too many customers because you attracted them and no capacity to serve. So it's never flown. Millimeter wave, probably Philippines, a long way to go. And even the incumbent operators doing traditional 5G, still a long way to go.
Jerry, are you seeing the same thing, the complementary between 5G and fiber?
Absolutely. From our perspective, fiber fuels 5G. So we need the fiber to roll out 5G, and even whether we're looking at private cellular opportunities for a campus environment, let's say, fiber is critical to the rollout of 5G. So the two, to us, work hand in hand, and we're obviously deeply committed to both.
Thank you. And
sorry, I forgot a very important data point, no? Yeah. Last quarter was the first quarter that fixed broadband wireless subscriptions actually declined in the Philippines. And the two operators are saying, well, driven by fiber migration. So very interesting insight there.
So flipping over to regulation, right? So we've talked about the competitor, we talk about the dynamics in the macroeconomics. We know there's a lot of push for broadband penetration. The US have also launched the infrastructure build, there's the EU digital decade. How are the different players managing the regulation or using it as leverage to push out their fiber? Andres, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is we think all of the regulatory work, the government subsidy work around broadband and fiber is fantastic. I mean, it's whether it's in the U.S. or in Europe or other countries, it's addressing a really important fundamental need, which is to close the digital divide and make the economics, particularly of rural broadband, feasible. We think it's going to spur tremendous innovation and economic growth, and so we think it's a really great thing. And what we noticed too, whether it's the stimulus bills, the 3 stimulus bills behind the pandemic, or the infrastructure bill in the U.S. that just passed, or some of the FCC programs or the NTIA programs, is that there's greater sophistication among regulators emerging than existed before. And by that I mean, for example, there is and there's going to be a lot more money for middle mile as opposed to last mile, which, for all the reasons that this panel has been saying all hour long, is critical to building out that ecosystem that's going to support the broader broadband ambitions of the country. So we're very bullish on these initiatives. We've got a number of irons in the fire at Zayo around kind of the first tranche of funds in the U.S., which is, again, mostly stimulus related. We've got the NTIA last mile dollars, and then the historic infrastructure bill in the States is really, I think, going to cause an explosion in broadband, and is going to lead to much more successful and prolific public-private partnerships as a result.
Are you seeing the same for on your side, Jerry, at AT&T?
Yeah, I mean, certainly echo the comments in terms of, reaching into communities, areas, rural areas where we can build out and provide broadband services. And I would also, on the business side, we've introduced a MegaGig offer, symmetrical upload and download, that I think is extremely attractive. And so we are trying to key in on both the consumers and small businesses across the U.S., but clearly committed, as well as the Biden infrastructure bill, we're certainly supportive.
Eric, what are you seeing over in the EU?
Well, in the EU, it's, I think, one of the main achievements is that there is a common view on how to make sure that there is a level playing field in telecoms infrastructure in Europe, which is a good thing. It took quite a while to get there, but it's there now. If you look at the implementation, it differs per country because they have the same framework, but the position of the incumbent per country is different. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you take the Netherlands, there has been a lot of regulation on KPN, the incumbent, for many years, and now the situation is quite fair now, and you see that the rules are relaxed a little bit. If you look at countries like Germany or France, it's much more strict because there is a real big position of the incumbent, and you cannot talk about totally fair playing field yet. But the same approach has been applied for all the countries, which is good. So eventually, all of them will get there. Where I think Europe is still lagging behind is much more on regulation for, supporting the rollout of networks. So permitting is a nightmare in Europe. It really is. Sometimes you have to go way down to the local village council to get your stuff done, which doesn't really scale. So I think the next step for the European regulation will be to get also those things sorted out, learning from other countries where this is much more easy to do. Mm-hmm. And that will be the next frontier. But the first frontier that they were targeting, and quite successfully, is making sure that the incumbent is regulated, so you get a fair playing field. Yeah.
So one of the biggest regulation out of the EU is duct sharing. Have you encountered any issue with the duct sharing regulation that had come out in the last years?
Where it is relevant, because not all countries in Europe will have a duct sharing ruling, because we don't have ducts in all Europe, right? So you mentioned Spain, I mentioned France, they're well known, there you have it. If you look at the Netherlands, there are no ducts, it's all buried, so you cannot benefit from that. But where it is applicable, the same framework is applied and you have access to ducts and you can use it very effectively, very effectively.
Thank you. So there's one question about the green initiatives and how this is impacting fiber deployment. So I'm just put it out into the group, any comments about the green initiatives as a priority when we're speaking about fiber deployment?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take a shot at that. Increasingly, whether it's investors or regulators or other shareholders or stakeholders, green is fundamental to your business is becoming an imperative, not a nice to have. Coincidentally, Zayo yesterday announced the first ever by a U.S. Broadband provider ESG-backed term loan that we secured and announced yesterday. And we're super excited about it, and not only for the impact it's going to have on the environment, but also, again, our customers, our employees, our shareholders increasingly demand that we step up in that way and make a contribution.
Definitely. Any other comments from anyone else on the board?
Well, I think fiber optic networks, by definition, of course, have a less of a impact on the carbon footprint compared to copper networks or coax networks, which is a fact. I think it also helps in the sense that it enables customers to work remotely and therefore have less movement. So also making let's say a second order contribution to being more environmental friendly. But I think where we need to be a bit critical on ourselves is that building the network in itself, of course, has an impact. So we are looking at how we can become carbon neutral in the way we build networks. And that's not obvious. And how can you become circular in building the network, which is not obvious as well. So at Eurofiber, we have decided that we will put ourselves a strict target to be both carbon neutral and circular by 2030, showing that not only we have a contribution with our network to our customers being environmental friendly, but we are environmentally friendly ourselves as well. And this is the next step that we need to do, improving that we are really contributing in the best way we can.
And power is the other area where, we're not inherently green in many places.
So considering time, I wanted to ask all of you to give your perspective on what you think the future of fiber would be like in the next 5 to 10 years. And we'll start with you, Jerry. We'll go down the line.
Sure. Fiber is, again, going to be key to deliver on the demands of both consumers and business, whether it's small business enterprise. We will continue, when you look at the exponential growth, I mentioned earlier the number of consumers that are, the consumption of data at home is incredible, and it's growing exponentially. And so we see just a tremendous demand coming, a huge wave. And so our investments in fiber, I think, are key to our success going forward, and certainly we're highly committed, as we are 5G. So when you think of AT&T, it's fiber and 5G, and that's how we see the future.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, it resonates with me as well. The future of fiber is bright. I think the most important challenge will be how can we keep fiber relevant in all the different complex use cases that are hitting us. So we're talking with utility companies, how we can help them to go to smart metering and all the changes that they have to make to their core business, where fiber can play a big role, but we are not always seen as part of the equation. Same holds for 5G and Open RAN and all these new technologies, where we have to make our fiber offering really relevant and usable. So I think fiber in itself is clearly there to stay, and it will grow in its importance, but we need to find maybe an even more sophisticated way to get engaged with all these different and complex use cases that are coming to us.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, I see the investment. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if this is working properly, but investment will continue at the pace it's at now, or if not greater, in my mind. We start conversations with customers before we've even defined scope related to the specs of the fiber, the characteristics of the fiber, the latest test results. So we believe that the customers are going to be out there continuing to demand fiber to their enterprise, to their data center, to whatever it is, to their home, to their small cell rather. So I don't see this slowing down, and I think that quality of the fiber is going to be more important as we go.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, I would just echo what has been said and where we started, which is we think the future is very bright for fiber. All of the tailwinds, macro and micro, support not just fiber as a nice to have, but as an absolute indispensable service. And I think the one thing we haven't talked about that as we think 5-10 years into the future, I do think what you will see, not unlike what has happened in the data center business as an example, is I do think you will see an acceleration of consolidation in fiber. To rationalize some of the economics and to give scale and investment at the level that's going to be required to keep up with demand.
Thanks, Andres. Jesus?
Yeah. We believe that there is no single silver bullet. You know, the demographics are very different, and there is a place for every technology solution. So, you know, we get asked that 5G question a lot because we're pure fiber. We don't think it's a relevant question. We think that, you know, 5G and wireless serves a specific market, same as satellite will become important soon in our country. But we believe that fiber will be the heart of everything. We're going to push to get it to as many households as possible. But the reality is it will be impossible to do so. There will be people who live in islands. There will be rich people who live in islands who may afford their own submarine cable. But there will be poor people who live in islands, best served maybe by satellite. And on the fringes of the metro, hopefully 5G soon. So everything will be there, but running on the fiber network. That's our point of view. So it's a bright future.
Even satellite needs fiber at the end.
Oh yeah, you're right. The hubs need to be connected by fiber.
So that's our panel, Fiber to the Everything, Bright Future. Thank you for you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers. That was a great session. And thank you to the audience. We've had so many questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through them all, but thank you. Our next session will be starting on the hour, and it's looking at rural connectivity. So a great follow-on from that last point. So I hope you'll stick around. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.